Within this lesson, I want to talk about forms. So forms are probably one of the more complicated pieces of HTML in order to understand that. And the thing with forms to keep in mind, they're not particularly going to do very much without having a backend to receive that form data. So passing through just that form information, it's really not going to do a lot unless you have the backend code to receive it. But having said that, it's also still important to understand how to create forms, because with web pages, forms are everywhere. And even when you're doing like contact forms, I don't actually see, but there's probably one here for donate. So any kind of interaction you want to happen with the user, we're going to need some kind of form. So this one here, a lot of times there is some form in order to do the donation. And we can see that this is indicative of how the forms will work. So we're going to be actually taken to a PayPal form if we click this. So forms pass data from the user into the backend code. And it gives the user the ability to actually interact with your web page. So as I said, typically it's used for contact and also for shopping carts or anything that we need to send code back, information back to backend code. So in order to create a form, it's going to be really straightforward and easy. So much like the other HTML elements that we've created, opening and closing for the form, and the form contents get placed in the middle here. So with forms, there's a number of different types of form elements, and with HTML5 we're introduced to a whole lot more. So by default, one of the simplest ones is text, and usually we put a name as well for it, and this helps us when we're picking up that form information on the back end. So when I do something like form here, and I go out to my code, refresh it, there's not much happening. So it's an input area, and this is all that we see. So typically with a form, you need a mechanism or a trigger in order to actually submit that content. So that's going to be a submit button, or any other type of way. If you're doing it with JavaScript, there's a number of different ways to do this. So I'm just going to do type equals submit. So this is going to give us a submit button, refresh it, and we see that now we've got a submit button. So when I click it, we see that because we haven't actually specified where the code is supposed to go, whenever I click it, it actually re-renders it onto the page, but we see that it sends it here within the URI. So it's got that full name, so the name of the field and the data that I've entered in here. So new data, when I hit submit, we'll see it again placed within the URL here. So that's refreshing the page, reloading the page, passing through that information. So ideally, if this page isn't really set up to receive that information, if we don't have any code that's actually picking up this URI information, we shouldn't be passing it into the page. We should actually have a location where we're trying to submit it. And that's where action comes in. So action allows us to specify where we're going to submit that form data. So I'm actually going to submit it over to editor because I don't have any other page right now that's set up. And so basically now when I refresh it, page, I hit submit, we see that it brings it over to editor. And this is going to work in the same way as the hyperlinks worked, so we can set a target if we want. And the same format where we can do blank, because we notice that by default it was sending it on top of the current page. So now we're just doing blank, much like the hyperlinks. And also with forms, you have a few different options here where you can specify the method. Now typically it's going to do a get method, and that the difference between get and post is that get we actually see within the URI, and post is going to be more secure. It's going to give us the ability to pass this data within the back of the code, and it's not going to place that within the URI. So when I refresh it, and now I type something here, we see that we're no longer passing it within the URI, but we are still passing through that data from the form. So if we had our server code set up, we'd be able to pick up that post information and process it and do something with it. So there's a number of other options here for different input types. And as I said, with HTML5, we were introduced to a whole bunch of new ones. So we had things like email here. And the other really cool thing about HTML5 is if I'm expecting an email format within this field, and if I don't receive it and I click submit, it's automatically got a check to see if this is an actual valid email, and if it's not, it actually doesn't let me submit the form. So this is built in within HTML5, and previous to this we would have to write some JavaScript in order to check to make sure that it's a properly formatted email, but it's a good thing that they've added this in because it's really simplified that format. And again, we have a whole bunch of really built-in, really cool built-in types. So this one is previous one to HTML5 where we can do a password. So all this does is just obscure the field information. So we see that whenever we're typing our password, we don't actually see what's being typed in there. And I think I forgot to close that off. That's why we're only getting, so here, name and password. So this is the password one. So we can't actually see what's typed in there. And this is how to pass more secure data. So it's not visual to the user. And of course, the backend still picks this up as a regular text string. And speaking of text, so if we had a whole bunch of text that we wanted to enter into the string, we would use something like text area. And here we have to specify the number of rows for this text area. So I want to make it 8 rows and columns. So this is going to be how wide it is. So maybe I'll make it 40 columns wide. And so we can see that this one works different than our previous form information. These were just types, and then this is going to provide us a whole text area that where we can enter stuff into it. And we can copy and paste. So that's how you start creating and structuring forms, and of course there's quite a lot of different options as well. So I'll quickly run through some of the different options for picking up form data. So I'm going to just change these around because so I don't have those saved ones showing up. So we do have another one, select. Select gives us a drop down, so that's typically we have a whole bunch of options. So they're just called options. And do a whole bunch of options here. So do 2 and 3. And additionally, we should always set in some values for these options as well, because we're not going to typically know what what we want to pick up on the options. So opt, and then here we would set a value for that option. So if we want it to equal 1, and so on. So we can set a whole bunch of new values into there. So it doesn't necessarily need to translate to what the user sees as to the value that we're doing. So we could even do something like this and only pass numeric values back to the back end, but allow the user to be able to see all these values to on the front end. So I'm going to change that to get so we can better see what is actually going to get sent through. And here's our selectable drop down. And when we hit submit, oh yeah, this has to be an email now. So just email formatted. And we can see this is the information that gets selection that we had entered in. And the reason we always need to specify a name, so we had to put a name. The server's not going to know how to pick that. We can see that it actually doesn't pass that selection value. as opposed to over here it passed it through. So that's why we have to make sure that we do specify names in order for it to be able to get picked up on the other end, pick up the data that we're passing through.